We're absolutely delighted to be able to welcome Mark Jones, our speaker this evening. Mark is an astrologer, a psychosynthesis therapist and hypnotist. He's based in South Wales. He's the founder of the Pluto School of Evolutionary Astrology and the author of Healing the Soul, Pluto, Uranus and the Lunar Nodes, and The Soul Speaks, The Therapeutic Power of Astrology. And Mark's latest book, The Planetary Nodes and Collective Evolution, has just been published. So we feel very honoured and delighted to have a talk at this particular point in time. So thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Thank you for having me, everyone. And just before I share my screen, I'll just say my normal work is really kind of fusing a spiritually orientated psychotherapy with the transformational power of astrology to help people heal with personal mentoring with people all around the world. Helping people set up astrology coaching practices, offering counseling skill trainings for astrologers, psychosynthesis coaching programs, and also teaching people in masterclasses the fusion of how to use astrology to affect genuine therapeutic transformation in people's lives. Today is a bit of an anomaly. Today I'm sharing 10 plus years of research. So let's just say a couple of things before I start, and I'll just share the screen just for the title page. Don't worry if you don't understand some of this talk. No one understands some of this talk. I do not understand some of the implications of this work. This work is picking up the late thought of Dane Rudhyar, and this work is contained in my latest book, The Planetary Nodes and Collective Evolution. This is the product of the last 12, 15 years of research, and including the last 3 years, I've been working with a professional astrological researcher who works for me, basically full time, and this is one of the projects. And this project really has been an attempt to explicate what Dane Rudhyar seemed obsessed about towards the end of his life. And I think personally that Rudhyar is a very serious figure, that he made an enormous contribution to the field. And in his later work, he emphasized the lunar and planetary nodes as being of extreme importance. Why? What are they? Why are these things so interesting? Let's get straight to it. All the planets form a nodal axis, not just the moon. Everybody uses the moon's nodes, but actually any planet that crosses the ecliptic creates a node. The work I detail in this book is the nodes of Jupiter outwards, hence the title and collective evolution. So today we're going to be looking at the planetary nodes of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Pluto, Neptune, and also Chiron is studied in the book as well. So we're looking at the fact that even these larger planetary cycles, the social planets of Jupiter and Saturn and the outer planets form nodal axes. What is a nodal axis? The nodes are abstract points in space formed by the orbit of a planet. There is nothing at a node. When the astrologer is talking about your north node, there is no piece of rock with a sign saying north node in the sky. It is an abstract point in space. It is the point when an upward rising planet intersected the ecliptic, and the south node is created when the planet goes down across the ecliptic. So nodes are polar. There are always two of them, because it's describing orbital motion. And let me just say a point here, and this is very profound for the lunar nodes. This idea, the astrologer can single out your north node and tell you about that, or somehow tell you that your south node is bad or something you did in the past. To me, it's an illusion. Rudhyar is completely clear. They are electrical poles of meaning. The key is that the nodal axis have the electricity move along it. The key to the power of the North Node is that the South Node flowers into being, not that you somehow shame it as a bad past or something you have bad karma around, or you did that too much. And you can say this sounds childish, but in my work as a transformational mentor, I have people call me who are weeping real tears at the beginning of a reading, say, my South Node is in the 7th house. My North Node is in the 1st. I'm not meant to have a relationship this lifetime. This kind of thinking actually exists, and it exists to the level that people become genuinely upset. I put it to you, with no disrespect to these people, that this is a nonsense idea. That the nodes of the moon and the nodes of planets are much more complex and subtle phenomena, and they cannot be understood separately. They have to be understood together because they are an axis. So this is Rudyard's great point about the lunar and planetary nodes. And he says quite explicitly at one point that the nodes are more important than planets. And this is his reasoning. Because a planet is a single fixed body, and a node represents the entire motion symbolically of that body. So a node is giving you way more history about the developmental procedures relative to the planetary archetype. That's his first and central point. The node is always describing a parabola of motion, and therefore it is giving you more info than just a natal planetary position. So this becomes the basis of Rudyard's late vision of what he calls orbital astrology. Astrology of dynamic motion, not just fixed static points. But it's more than this. So Rudyard takes the idea that the nodes are important because they describe a parabola of motion, but this parabola of motion is only created by intersecting the ecliptic, and the ecliptic is the apparent path of the sun and the earth in relationship. So it's the apparent path of motion of the earth around the sun. So it's not just that the nodes are important because they imply a parabola of motion, i.e. an entire evolutionary arc of a planet, but it's because that arc is described at the moment it intersects the Earth-Sun relationship. And the Earth-Sun relationship to Rudyard is the single central sense of meaning that we have in our solar system. So nodes are significant because there's two of them, and they are effectively like a cannonball, or an arrow. They describe an arc, and that arc is the evolution of the planetary archetype itself. And then that parabola of motion comes into being because it intersects the ecliptic, and the ecliptic is the fundamental relationship. It's the plane on which we find the zodiac constellations, and it's the fundamental relationship of the Earth to the sun. And it's therefore speaking about the existential, psychological, and spiritual meaning of life on Earth from Rudyard's point of view. So he says effectively that the nodes are the fundamental portal into the essential quality of a planet and the way that this planet affects the very structure and roots of our individuality. Now, I'm going to try and make a case that Dane Rudyard was not just a crazy old man, even though some of his books are difficult to read. Rudyard's one of those strange beasts. Every now and then, a tiny pamphlet of his is so profound, it changes your whole view of astrology. And for those who are interested, The Lunar and Planetary Nodes of 1971 for the Theosophical Society springs to mind, or the pamphlet From Humanistic to Transpersonal Astrology, which is so profound on a therapeutic level. I was reading sections of it, I felt like I was so into it, I felt like I could have written that paragraph myself. And yet he can write whole books that just seem like theosophical dross, that just seem full of abstract philosophical rumination that doesn't seem to go anywhere. Yet in all his clearest later work, he emphasizes the power of the nodes and not just the lunar nodes. Why? So I set out in this book to show people the historic significance of the nodes. Why did I do this to such great lengths? Because I'm one of those great believers in a simplified chart. When I look at charts for people, it doesn't even have all the asteroids on. I do not like clutter on my charts. I like to be able to see the core aspects very clearly. Why would I come up with new positions for us to look at? It's a horrible thing to do to astrology, isn't it? Astrology is already so complex. Why have anything else? It's hard enough just dealing with the initial planetary bodies. So this has to be worth it. This is my brief attempt to show you in some ways it's worth it. When Pluto was discovered, it was on its own north node. There are also planetary node significant aspects in other planets' discovery charts. The single planetary discovery that seems to symbolize the power of the 1930s, the Great Depression, the rise of National Socialism in Central Europe, etc., is discovered conjunct its own north node. Is this insignificant? I don't think so. The planetary body of Pluto seems to be sensitive to its own nodal axis. Let's take a couple of the most collectively influential events of the 20th century and see how the planetary nodes might be involved. This is the very exact chart timed by the US military to the minute, to the second even, of the first use of atomic weaponry in civilian life, in mainstream life. And if you look at the midheaven here, you can see that Uranus, the planet, is conjunct the midheaven of that moment, and that both those positions are conjunct to the degree of the north node of Uranus. And this is where we see the north node of Uranus. You see when tanks are first introduced in the First World War. You see it when tech is used in a revolutionary way, when people make breakthroughs. Freud's moon was on the north node of Uranus, and he goes into the personality and the basement and your mother complex and your Oedipal complex. Moon on the node of Uranus. Einstein had a link to the node of Uranus. Copernicus had moon on the south node of Uranus in Sag, or close to it. These are people associated with revolutionary ideas. And here we see the first moment that the fruits of the Manhattan Project hit the world stage, the first moment where the splitting of the atom leads to this devastating impact on the world. Uranus aligns exactly with the midheaven and its own north node. You also see the Saturn moon culminating conjunct the north node of Pluto. And we realize, don't we, that this event effectively ended the Japanese Empire, caused an entire people to change its relationship to the world and to power. And then you see Pluto conjunct the north node of Neptune, and you see this as the Holocaust was discovered, the final solution, and you see it in the use of the atomic bomb in 1945. Pluto to the north node of Neptune. And we'll see later on the north node of Neptune being linked to human creativity and aspiration and dreams. And Pluto to the north node of Neptune, humanity encounters the destructive essence of its own power. It discovers just how far its own power can be pushed and to what end. The explicit film footage shot by the first Russian, British and American soldiers entering the concentration camps and the footage of the atom bombs stream around the world at the same time. It's kind of immediate, instantaneous, massive tech revolutionary devastation. And then just out of interest, you can see how specific it all is. You can see that the Nagasaki atomic bomb has Saturn on the north node of Pluto by the midheaven. And look at the midheaven of the moment. The midheaven of the moment is conjunct the north node of Saturn. So Saturn's on the north node of Pluto, and the midheaven of that moment is conjunct the north node of Saturn. And it's this second bomb that leads to the decision to surrender and effectively the end of the empire. And it's a vote. The generals are evenly divided at 2-2, and the emperor himself casts the casting vote and votes to surrender. So it was that close, even with the second atom bomb. So you can see, looking at the two charts, the planetary nodes are more specific. One actually shows the power, the midheaven of the moment of that event hitting the world is all about the revolutionary impact, the shock, the horror, the, what have we built? What have we made? The destroyer of worlds quote from Oppenheimer, quoting the Bhagavad Gita about the destructive power of man. And then we go to the Nagasaki event and you can see it's a Saturn event. This is the one that makes the difference. Oh, they can do it again. It's not a one-off. and it brings the whole horrifically painful conflict in the Pacific Islands and the Philippines over at the end of the Second World War. This is the chart of the 9/11 terrorist event in New York. And we see here that the Pluto-Saturn opposition that was widely picked up on at the time is conjunct the nodes of Uranus. That using commercial airliners as mobile bomb technology is a revolutionary use of technology. And because what? South node of Uranus in Sagittarius, for religious, ideological reasons, out of some crusade or jihad. So this Pluto-Saturn opposition, which people notice at the time and notice, you know, death by flight, Pluto in Sagittarius, Saturn in Gemini, the two towers that come down, are on the nodes of Uranus, and they change the world. They change the nature of air travel for decades to come. They change the notion of security alert levels, especially in America, from Homeland Security. This is an impact event that changes the collective psyche of the modern world. And that's what the planetary nodes seem to be speaking about in their impact. They seem to speak of events where a collective dimension of evolution rips through, either in an event or in a personal natal chart, where people or events are elevated as symbolic of a collective significance. Now, let me try and draw you historically up to the present day and our current world crisis. All the planetary nodes of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto are all South Node Capricorn, North Node Cancer. This is in a lineup that Rudyard noted in his 1971 pamphlet that I based my initial research on, but he didn't have a clear idea as to why. It seems enormously significant, especially when we start to build to the modern huge transit structures that we've been living through. But let me trace it historically, and I'm sure these slides will be available. I can make these slides available to people if they're interested. They're also primarily in the book, and there is way more information in the book. But this is a layout of the basic heliocentric planetary node positions and the approximate orb of the geocentric planetary positions as laid out. So you see North node of Pluto and South node of Pluto, roughly 18 Cancer Cap. You see the nodes of Jupiter earlier in Cancer Cap, roughly 9, and the nodes of Saturn around 22 Cancer Cap. And we'll come back to this. But let me show you historically the nature of Pluto-Saturn conjunctions, just very briefly. We can't spend all our time on this, but my researcher has laid out for you here all of the planetary Saturn-Pluto alignments in the last 2,000 years. Only one previous one was close to the nodes of Pluto and Saturn. So when Pluto and Saturn, these are conjunctions of Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn, sorry, to be clear. And only one of them is close to the South Node positions, and that's the one of 783. Let me just show you briefly some events from around that time period. You have the hugely important translations of Buddhist sutras into Chinese and the spread of Buddhism in China. You have Charlemagne crowned Holy Roman Emperor. So you have this legacy after the Dark Ages of an attempt to recreate in Western Christendom a version of the Roman Empire, again, through Central Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor. You have the foundation of the Habsburg dynasty. So look here, this conjunction here is Sun node to South node of Pluto. Power placements. Pluto here is to the North node of Saturn, but the Sun is on the South node of Saturn with the foundation of the Habsburg dynasty. You see the nodes of Pluto and Saturn constellated in so many power plays from the Cold War, from the Gulf conflicts, from the Second World War. It's just breathtaking. The book spells this out. We don't have room in this context to show the entire history of warfare or the section on the history of slavery, which all seems to come down to the South node of Saturn and the nodes of Chiron. This wounding around authority over others, Chiron to the nodes of Saturn. But I'm trying to build this picture here of epochal events with conjunctions to the nodes of Pluto and Saturn. Empires building, imperialism, the Game of Thrones. You see here the Protestant Reformation happening with the Saturn-Pluto alignment on the south node of the moon, on the south node of Jupiter. The change, the revolutionary change in authority around the religious experience of Christendom. That's with Luther and, you know, his personal crisis of faith leading to the questioning of the Catholic Church and effectively a huge split at the heart of European Christendom. To summarize this impact a second, this is a table that I shared at the UAC conference in Chicago in 2018. And to just give a bit of atmosphere, the hotel had made these huge mistakes about rooms for speakers. And even though they'd opened up these double rooms, many speakers were having this situation where the room was intensely crowded. I had my laptop in front of me with a PowerPoint behind, and I literally had 20-25 people sat cross-legged around my laptop. I couldn't move even a foot either side of me because there were so many people speaking, sitting on the floor who were actually reading the PowerPoint from my laptop screen, not the screen on the wall because of the angle of which they were positioned. And in this sort of atmosphere with this microphone trying not to move at all, I shared one of these breakthrough pieces of research. If the Hiroshima example or 9/11 wasn't enough, we discovered in the history of the major conflicts of the last few centuries, with the biggest impact on the world and the biggest death toll, that they are starting usually with a Pluto transit to the node of Saturn, and that they are ending with a major outer planet transit to the node of Neptune. And it's kind of mind-blowing. You just see it time and time again. A major outer planet aspect to the node of Saturn, often Pluto, as at the start of the world conflict, and a major outer planet aspect, often Pluto, but sometimes Neptune, to the node of Neptune to end that major conflict. So just to spell this out. And, you know, it was certain individual examples when I shared in a Mountain Astrologer article on Alan Turing, the breaker of the Enigma code, his Mercury in Cancer conjunct the node of Jupiter, a man whose love of puzzles, Mercury, led to a breakthrough vision that changed the shape of a major world conflict. As these examples started to come together time and time again in the research, this kind of mind-blowing collective significance sat just behind the world, not just in the outer planet nodal, not just in the outer planet structures, transit such structures or synodic cycles, the kind of material covered by Richard Tarnas in Cosmos and Psyche, but actually their nodal axes and their own interaction with those nodes. That it was starting to shape entire movements of history or appearing to reveal this collective dimension of meaning just in the background. And this becomes very relevant when exploring the current dilemmas. And so some of you are probably already on top of this, but the current Saturn-Pluto conjunction of early 2020 occurred on the south node of Saturn and the south node of Pluto. It was almost exact to the south node of Saturn, but it's very, very close to the geocentric south node of Pluto. This, when we were doing this planetary node research, we could see the early 2020 coming a long time away. In fact, there was a point when my researcher was so deeply buried in it, he was convinced we were heading for a major world conflict because the pattern was just so prescient in the previous few centuries. If you just remember our war table, just to go back to it, excuse the flicking, but you know, the American War of Independence, the Taiping Revolution, the US Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War, all followed this pattern of outer planet transits to the node of Saturn to start it and the node of Neptune to finish it. And here we had this huge alignment taking place on the node of Saturn. And as we all know, it was a different kind of conflict. It was a different kind of war. It was a different kind of experience that shut the world down. And here I've provided sort of detailed breakdown. I won't, you know, just micro-analyze it now for you. I'll give you a kind of shape of it, if you like, and these slides can be, you know, looked at in more detail if you wish to. But we see this multiple activity occurring, so much of it on the nodes of Saturn and Pluto. So we have the original Saturn conjunct Pluto alignment on the 12th of January. By the 13th of Feb, Saturn is exactly conjunct the south node of Saturn geocentrically. Mars and Jupiter conjoin the south node of Pluto. So we see that the events of the 2020 could be seen from a planetary node perspective to hold this huge hovering background significance several years ago. In fact, someone in that same UAC presentation raised the 2020 alignment to me as a question, because there was this kind of sigh, this like almost when I shared that about the complex, massive global conflicts occurring under these signatures. And someone, you know, some bright spark pointed out what we were heading to in 2020, and all I could say was, I just don't know. You know, I'm sincere here. I'm not trying to use this to predict the future of the collective. I'm trying to understand the past so that we can begin as a community a detailed assessment of what these positions might hold, you know, what fruit they might bring over time. But we've just laid out here with my researcher just the events of this year. And again, I'm sure most of you have been following the news, but we've had huge themes of politics and social unrest. And we've had enormous, and we see Jupiter going to Pluto. We see the economy crash. The COVID crisis in March leads to the greatest economic crash in recent decades. You know, the world has gone into a state which the recovery from is, you know, way more serious than just, sadly, the people who've been affected by physical illness. That there will be social and economic and political and mental health consequences for years to come. And by the way, as my astrologer's researcher has noted here, the 1929 Wall Street crash occurred with Pluto at 19 Cancer, exactly conjunct its Cancer North Node. So just prior to its discovery chart, it had already come to its own North Node and then retrograded back. And that's when the Wall Street crash happened. And here we see in the 2020 signature, it goes to its own South Node and the South Node of Saturn. And we see the biggest fallout in the market in the world linked to the COVID crisis. Someone has already mapped the impact of the spread of the virus to the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, that whenever that conjunction's been at the tightest, the virus has absolutely exploded in numbers. And then when it kind of, that aspect goes into more of a spaciousness, the virus numbers drop. It's quite an interesting chart. It does seem to have a correlation. But what I'm pointing out is that the bigger nodal situation behind indicated this as a crisis moment for civilization years before. I was aware of this years ago, that 2020 would hold something that was significant for the current phase of civilization, if you like. And here we see, you know, the weather patterns, the chaotic weather patterns. And right in the summer, Pluto comes to exact to the south node of Saturn. Jupiter, the south node of Pluto. So I've just laid all this out so that people can follow it. The natural disasters that occurred within this period. But, you know, so clearly in all of this, the COVID-19 virus crisis, the SARS-CoV-2 viral pattern, has produced effectively like a kind of war atmosphere, but really interestingly, without really per se a real enemy. I mean, people can project an enemy, but actually, if you think about it, it's the ultimate silent war, isn't it? And unlike my granddad having to go and leave his infant son, my father, and go to a training camp near Gloucester or whatever, and then go off on like D-Day 2 or something and fight his way through Belgium and France. It's like we have to sit in and deal with whatever crisis, or manage our sense of anxiety, or go deeper within, or binge on Netflix or something. We have this kind of crisis of the fact that this war zone has happened with an invisible enemy, which is an interesting thing collectively in terms of the world, isn't it? If enemies are shadow projections of everything that we can't own, or they are an imperialistic rival, we've reached this point, at least in some parts of the world, where globalization has reached this peak where the enemy becomes that which undermines the globalization rather than a specific social group, nationalist group, or whatever. But I want to draw our attention to something, an even bigger pattern we discovered when we looked into this, at the risk of just piling on too much here. And please remember, no one understands these things, right? This is the product of me doing 12 years of research on this. Do I understand all of this? No, I do not. Let's not, let's be gentle with ourselves. This is not something you're going to be able to take in straight away. This potentially has enormous implications. Hence the 2.5 years, 3 years carefully writing a book and it going through 4 different editors to make sure the message was as clear as possible. And it includes all sections of different individual charts. It includes a history of the rise of depth psychology, analyzing psychologists' charts from the planetary nodes. It has a history of science section, looking at Alexander Fleming, Einstein, various people through the lenses of the planetary nodes. But we took this amount of time on it because it's just so strange, because it's just so kind of weird and mind-blowing, really. But to take that maybe to its greatest pitch of all, this current Jupiter-Pluto-Saturn alignment on the south node of Pluto, which is roughly 18 Capricorn, on the south node of Saturn, which is most regularly around 21, 22 Capricorn, we have this other phenomenon that during the time of Christ, Neptune's nodal range, which is now in Leo Aquarius, was 18 to 22 Cancer Capricorn. So Neptune's nodes at the time of Christ were the same as Pluto's nodes and Saturn's nodes now. That Saturn and Pluto just hit. The Pluto and Saturn conjunction in Capricorn of the recent era came onto this historic Neptune, what we've taken to calling Christ point, in December of 2019. It's the first ever conjunction since the time of Christ on this point. And it occurred whilst the Pluto-Saturn were also on their south nodes. So it's the alignment of Pluto-Saturn on the point that Neptune's nodes were at during the spiritual impulse of Western civilization, the Christ event, as Steiner called it. And now Pluto and Saturn come to it 2,000 and so years later, and also their nodal axis comes to that point. So they don't just conjunct on that point. Their nodal axis works its way geocentrically through time to the same point that the nodal axis of Neptune was during the time of Christ. And I put it to you, are we seeing in Western civilization the original spiritual impulse, Neptune, the nodes of Neptune, of Christianity, taking a Plutonic and Saturnine form? That we have reached a point where the spiritual impulse of the West, primarily through the fairly radical, early origins of Christianity and its later combination with classical culture through medieval scholasticism, and even you could argue Christianity informing the values of the Enlightenment, even if it took a somewhat different intellectual position, have we come to a fundamental endpoint in that impulse or transition point? Are these changes that are happening in this sort of radicalized sense of collective anxiety that ripples through the world actually part of a larger fundamental shift in inner impulse within civilization itself? I think of the work of the classics scholar Peter Kingsley, who has written extensively about the fact that in his view, Western civilization was birthed by an ecstatic spiritual experience, and that the early pre-Socratic philosophers, people like Parmenides and Empedocles, are not the founders of logic, which Western philosophy have reduced them to, but they were actually effectively composers of mystical poems, speaking of the spiritual impulse that formed Western civilization. Is this spiritual impulse going through a fundamental transition? Is it changing? Is it losing its original power? And if we have time, we'll come at the end to some of Dane Rudhyar's thoughts on this subject. But certainly Peter Kingsley, in his latest book called Catafalque on Carl Jung's Red Book, argues that Jung saw in visions at the end of his life things that were removed by his secretary, Amelia Jaffe, from his book Memory, Streams and Reflections, one of his later compiled biographical works compiled by his secretary. She removed these visions of effectively the end of times or the end of civilization, which Kingsley argues is Jung's prophetic wisdom, seeing the fundamental spiritual transition that's occurring within Western civilization in our era. Is that what these planetary nodes are implying by crossing that fundamental point of where Neptune was in the time of Christ? These are big questions. I raise them out of interest. I raise them with the psychological and spiritual hope that it can give us a sense of vision and meaning in a time when lots of people are losing that, and in a time when lots of people can't just reach back to tradition. It doesn't seem as simple as you can just go back to, as it were, a naive Christianity, despite the fact that obviously the life and example of Christ seems a much higher example than many modern, pop stars or reality icons or modern magazines, or the values of modern commercial culture seem trivial compared to the moral magnificence of Christ. And yet at the same time, we can't just go back to these forms. Things have moved on. And there is a kind of, and you could argue, and it's interesting because Jung's Venus is on the north node of Pluto. You could argue that Jung's attempt to frame this thing called individuation was an attempt to deal with the disillusionment of his father, who was a priest, and to find a true internal esoteric experience of the mystical Christ, to revivify that tradition. And it is interesting because in later life, Jung owned one of the Gnostic Gospel codices. He personally funded, the research on the Gnostic Gospels. These are things for us to consider. Certainly, the alignment of Pluto and Saturn on their own nodes at the start of 2020, I watched it happen. Nothing seemed to happen. One day I was literally talking to my researcher. I was going, hey man, the great thing hasn't happened. And in the background somewhere, there was a little news report going, reports of a virus in China. It was literally like that. Now, the nodes of Neptune. I think you can make a case that Neptune on a collective level is to do with the collective field, the dream body of humanity, as Arnold Mindell, the process worker, would call it. Or you could say just some sort of sense of the infinite, or the loss of boundaries, or sense of our total experience of being human, or the collective unconscious of humanity, you might say in Jungian terms. And since the 11th century, the nodes of Neptune transitioned over a long period between about 1080 something or 1070 something and about 1200. They transitioned out of Cancer Capricorn into Leo Aquarius. And here I want to change tone slightly and explain the sort of background a bit more to the work I do. It became apparent to me as a psychotherapist in private practice in Bristol during the 2000s and during the noughties and the 2010s, that people were carrying enormous amounts of unresolved trauma on a level of their identity that they didn't seem particularly conscious of. And this reached a sort of extreme position when a long-term client of mine who'd had psychiatric issues before working with me just started spontaneously regressing into a series of prior lives that took me a while to work out that was what was going on. I had to remain very open-minded, very flexible, kind of work with whatever came up. But it began to influence my understanding of astrology because I'd studied with Green. I'd studied Noel Till's Masters in Synthesis and Counseling in the 1990s. I'd studied with Jeffrey Green in 1999, the one time he taught in London. And I was putting all of this material together, as well as training as a psychosynthesis therapist, which is effectively the first vision of spiritual psychology, created by an Italian doctor who was a student of Freud's, a contemporary of Freud's, and was a contemporary of Jung's at the Institute clinic, the Bacolzi, where they both trained. And as I began to put this together, I began to realize there are deeper layers within the identity with which people carried patterns relative to their memories, including memories from, shall we say, another dimension, what I started to call soul memory. Memories of identification with other lives or animal states, you know, even in some extreme cases, you know, just the biosphere of the planet. And I began to develop this vision around the nature of Uranus and its ruling of Aquarius. That Uranus, I followed the implications left by Rudyard when he said that Uranus was a higher octave of Mercury. And that effectively Mercury is like your short-term fluid intelligence, that Jupiter is like your intuitive vision or your higher mind or your set of philosophical or intuitive principles with which you discriminate what kind of Mercury data to take in. And that Uranus instead corresponded to what we could call the mental body, theosophically, or the mind of the aura, the memory of the aura, the memory of your energy field, which might remember things that you don't consciously remember in your particular identity. In fact, we could liken it to the metaphor Rudyard's using, the nodes versus planets. You know, your individual memory is like a planet. It's a fixed body in time and space, whereas your memory of your aura or soul memory is that memory evolving through multiple spatiotemporal dimensions at the same time. Could have very early childhood memories in it, could have memories of interuterine states, and this explains the work of Stanislav Grof, who worked with Richard Tarnas, allying astrology to psychedelic sessions, and Esalen in the 80s and 90s, and the Archive Journal summarizes this material very well. And it's in realizing that dimension that I began to realize the south node of Neptune's shift into Aquarius corresponded with this growing need over time, especially as we've reached this relative peacetime in the West, to face the memories within the individual and collective field. That actually the great healing vision or mission of our time, Neptune, is to recognize what we're carrying. And I would argue even the ecological crisis hasn't been fully understood. The toxins we create are not just petrochemical, you know, agricultural overspill that ruins the topsoil or goes into the river system. No, it's inside us. We are carrying our unresolved material, unresolved memories. And in effect, the north node of Neptune in Leo is that we all need that sense of importance about our creative flowering as people. You see these phenomena like your pop idol and your X Factor. And, you know, we can trivialize that. And frankly, sometimes I do, because I can be a bit of a cultural snob. But you see it's sincere as well. People want to have their moment. They need to have that sense of meaning. They need to have that sense of that moment in the sun. And this is actually important because they need to have sufficient creative agency for that those past memories to come through and them to feel sufficiently empowered to become a creative editor of their own memory suite, if you want to use a kind of Adobe Premiere metaphor or something, or some video editing metaphor. We have to become editors of our own memories. We have to choose the meanings around them and actually maybe let go of some of the memories, because trauma disempowers people so completely that they actually become more receptive to more trauma. And this is so problematic. It creates what I began to call karmic weather systems. Something bad happens to you, then you feel broken, then you take your brokenness into the next situation, and that radically increases the chances of something bad happening to you, and so on. And I began to realize, with the subtlety of the natal chart and its capacity through the lunar nodes to describe evolutionary arcs, through the planetary nodes to describe collective positions, we are recipients of an extremely powerful tool. And maybe astrology itself has a part to play in this healing. And I remember a talk very well that Richard Tarnas gave in Seattle, where he called astrology the gold standard of superstition in our era. That, you know, you're reading a science book, you're quite enjoying it, and you get to this point and it goes, you know, just like the difference between stupid astrology and amazing astronomy. And it uses that as a metaphor. And I want to put the science book down or throw it in the bin. Because, you know, we've had enough, you know, derivative stuff about this community. We've had enough looking down. I mean, you can say there are some problems in our community. I would argue there's some peacocking, there's some compensatory puffing up. Oh, astrologers are better than psychologists. The chart's so much, you know, better than therapy. It can be a rapid version of therapy and neatly bypass all of what therapy can do for people. But at the same time, we've also been denigrated too much. And, you know, maybe if astrology is the trash heap of civilization, as Daniel Dennett called it, and the civilization is beginning to lose its spiritual impulse, then maybe astrology becomes a different kind of gold that may be hidden in the waste material, in the rubbish, is some discarded gold that the civilization can't own. So I would love to say, really, despite all this very research heavy and must seem to some of you quite theoretical material presented today, that it's much more important to me, this sort of personal sense of agency, to engage with depth with our whole energy field and the advantages that astrology could give us. When understood from a certain perspective, you can see the natal chart as effectively an attempt of the soul to communicate with you. It's what Sri Aurobindo called the psychic being. And this is an idea that influenced Rudyard an enormous amount. Rudyard was reading Sri Aurobindo later in life and trying to integrate it. And Aurobindo's idea is that there's a radiatory aspect of the soul that he called the psychic being. And the psychic being is searching for you. It's kind of shining its presence so that it touches your individuality. And I would argue that's what the chart's doing. The chart is the symbolic shape of that outreach. And it therefore implies how you could follow that Ariadne's thread back to soul. Let me just say something. So when we looked at the war charts, so we realized something difficult happens when Pluto especially transits the south node of Saturn. And here we see in 2020, Pluto and Saturn transit together on the south nodes of Pluto and Saturn. But we also see quickly, so this repeats in January next year, you see Pluto again conjunct the south node of Saturn. But quite quickly, we see Jupiter conjunct the south node of Neptune. Now remember, these bigger outer planets coming to the nodes of Neptune symbolize this release from the past. You know, the surrender of the Japanese in World War II, the Treaty of Versailles in World War I. However problematic that was, it was an end to the war at the time. Now Jupiter, is that a big enough figure? No, although it might presage something else, preface something bigger coming through. You get Saturn there that quickly afterwards, you know, even though their orbs, Saturn's orb is much slower than Jupiter, they've both been stuck together in late Capricorn for a long time, and they both move quickly once they get into Aquarius, even Saturn before it retrogrades again. And then you see in the summer, Pluto go back to the south node of Saturn. So we're sort of wrestling with a new impulse. You see in the February-May signatures, this new possibility coming in, and then Pluto conjunct the south node of Saturn again. The deeper implications are going to take a very long time. But Saturn comes back by Christmas to the south node of Neptune. It's very interesting when you know that the south node of Neptune is so often involved in these more healing signatures. And you see again in 2022, Pluto goes back to the south node of Saturn. So what's going on right now is not going away soon, but you do see these glimpses of vision or hope. But you have to wait till 2031 before Pluto hits the south node of Neptune. And, you know, that's a much longer term process. Let me show you here a graph that my researcher compiled. This is Pluto and Neptune by position and by year. And the red line shows them beginning to come into orb, and then the thick red line shows them in orb on the south node of Neptune. And it actually reaches the first conjunction point, as you can see, where the line goes thin in 2031, but it's close by 3/4 of the way through 2028. Are some of the deeper impacts of what's been raised in the current situation only coming to full resolution then. I don't presume, I'm not going to sit here and make up fantasies about the future in that regard. I think astrology is quite dangerous in that regard, actually, and that people are often exposed for their naivete and thinking that that's what they ought to be doing, even, never mind whether they get it right or not. I mean, but then I was present at the ESAR conference in Orange County in 2016 or 2017, where the international, 2016, where the international and the American panel of astrologers, 10 astrologers in all, voted 10-0 that Hillary would win the election and that Trump would lose. So we can see the perils of predictive astrology in a nutshell in that anecdote. Now, I'll just show this, and then I think I will have time to share briefly the Dane Rudhyar comment. So this website has a lot of free resources on it, lots of podcasts I've done, lots of archived essays, lots of blog posts, including detailed stuff about how to calculate the planetary nodes in your own chart. So in the free section under the blog, if you just go back in pages and it's nicely spaced out, you will see detailed instructions from my researcher on how to find the planetary node positions in your own chart. All of that is on the plutoschool.com for free. And there's a wonderful piece of software called Planet Dance, created by a Dutch guy that we've been in touch with throughout this process, that is also a free calculator for your planetary node positions. Planet Dance software. But having raised this deeper question about civilization, let me just show you some quotes from Dane Rudhyar before I close and take some questions. This is Rudhyar's natal chart. He has Jupiter to the north node of Jupiter, and he has his Pluto, Mars, Neptune conjunction and descendant on the north node of Uranus. So we can see the attraction of the man to the planetary nodes and the way that his intellectual imagination, Pluto, Mars, Gemini, Neptune, Gemini, you know, his mental life having these visionary aspects to it, excuse me, why he picked up on these positions. But it really started when he had a mystical experience when he was 16 in Paris, when he had an intuitive realization that all life processes and the very essence of time were cyclic. This is an approximate chart for that moment. It can be detailed close, maybe the day, but we certainly don't have a time. But that doesn't matter for these outer planet cycles. Even the day could be out by a few days. But look at the lineup. Neptune's on the north node of Pluto and Saturn. Pluto's on the north node of Jupiter, which happens to also be his Jupiter. And Uranus is on the south node of Saturn. And he has this intuitive revelation about the cyclic nature of time. And I'm going to just share two quotes here that I relate back to that sense I had when exploring that historic Christ point about the arc of civilization itself. He became intuitively aware of the cyclic nature of all existence and the fact that our Western civilization was coming to an autumnal conclusion. Ever since that time, he had sought to gain a clearer understanding of the cyclic patterns and basic meaning of human existence. And he goes on that there is a fundamental choice of one in such a time to identify with the decaying leaves or with, and I quote Rudhyar, the small inconspicuous seeds that hold the promise of new life in the following spring. There's a question perhaps to leave us with, you know, what do we identify with in this time? How much of our deeper nature is ready to stay with this strange time of transition we find ourselves in, but use astrology, use psychology, use our deep connection perhaps to our own inner truth at our best to reimagine the future. Good luck, all of you, with that. I hope you've enjoyed that. You know, it's quite an intense romp through certain basic principles. There's an awful lot more in the book and an awful lot more of a detailed exploration of the planetary nodes operating through certain domains of human thought, not least the history of psychology, science, also an analysis of the Cold War, the life of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, of Gorbachev, just people that found themselves at the heart of huge seismic shifts in society and civilization. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was useful.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was a deeply thought-provoking presentation.